Okay. Well, we are at the appointed hour here, and I believe that everyone that we're expecting here is on now. So, good morning and welcome to the subgroup. For those of you who don't know me, I'm John Baird. I'm a senior consultant with Public Sector Consultants, and we'll be facilitating the conversation of the subgroup this morning. Just to recap a few things that Julie said just a little while ago, the public is welcome to join and observe these discussions, but we would ask that you please mute your phone and turn your camera off as we move forward here. And I also just want to recap a little bit of our process and facilitation approach. So the group is charged with reviewing the recommendations from the ASDO, and our focus today is really kind of in organizing our thinking. So we'll review those recommendations to, again, identify those that the subgroup members want to adopt or recommend moving forward, those that they do not believe are applicable or do not want to move forward, and then those that need additional refinement before the next meeting. And so, excuse me, we've got, a relatively short period of time here today. So for those that do require discussion or refinement, we'll ask that members work offline in between this meeting and the fourth meeting to craft that language and come back to the team with proposed revisions. And then we'll also kick off the discussion here today with a presentation from Luke to ground the discussion. So before we dive in, are there any questions on process or the approach here? Okay, well, if there are none, Luke, we can turn it over to you for the presentation that you have.
Great, thanks, John. I'll try to share the appropriate screen here. All right, you should all see PowerPoint in presentation mode, right? Hey, first try, what do you know? So I guess first a couple caveats or disclaimers that, this was really just to provide some additional background that, folks might not have and get the conversation started. I know we've received a lot of kind of very specific information requests, that would take some data crunching and some research. So that's not going to be in here today, but kind of just some more broad things, a background on the program, what we do and what the recommendations ASDSO are, so that we can get the conversation started. So with that, we're going to look at compliance, enforcement, and emergency response. Let's see. So it might help to understand what our typical compliance issues are that we see day to day. And typically it's pretty low order, like the owner did not submit an inspection report on time, or the report didn't have all the pieces and parts it needed. The owner didn't update their emergency action plan or hasn't completed an adequate emergency action plan. The owner is, there's recommendations in all the inspection reports for maintenance and repairs of dams that maybe had a time frame associated with them, do this by a year from now, 5 years from now, whatever, and the owner doesn't meet those recommended time frames. And those are kind of the low-level ones that we deal with a lot. Then every once in a while you'll have a condition that develops that puts the dam in danger, where it's an actual very serious condition that has a very tight time frame. Or the owner operates a dam in such a way that causes damage to the dam or the natural resources surrounding a dam, and that happens sometimes as well. A lot of times we also, get unauthorized activities at a dam where either on purpose or unknowingly the owner or the operator does some work that does require a permit and requires, engineering review and things like that, where we've had illegal construction or unpermitted construction of dams, unpermitted drawdowns and refills, unpermitted repairs, or even sometimes unpermitted removal of dams. So we have to, that's something we have to deal with typically as well. Probably the worst case is when a dam failure occurs, is, kind of our biggest compliance issue. And these are review from before, so I'll go through these quickly, but typically, we identify the deficiencies through the typical inspection reporting. if we're on site or see or hear, get a report from the dam owner that there's an issue at a dam. And then we'll start working with the dam owner to resolve that issue. But if the owner does not or cannot resolve those issues, we have to consider escalated enforcement. So the first step is typically to inform the owner that they're out of compliance with the statute. We usually start with a phone call or an email to, hey, you didn't submit the inspection report, or there's this deficiency that, you haven't addressed in a timely manner. What is the plan to get that taken care of? And we give them some time, to come into compliance voluntarily. So, a lot of, and these are just kind of bullets that, sometimes the inspection report was done or the EAP was updated and they just, for whatever reason, didn't get it to us. So a lot of times with that first phone call, you tell the person and they get it to you, and the problem's solved. Sometimes, or if they forgot or just didn't get around to it, they're usually pretty quick to try to rectify the situation. But sometimes, they're not, and we have to do the escalated enforcement. So our first step is usually to kind of ramp up the language from the friendly phone call or email to, hey, did you forget to do this, to a, hey, do this, submit a plan to have this action done by a certain date, and follow that plan and implement the remedy. When they don't do it, then we have these enforcement tools at our disposal, which I think we've gone over before too. Is we can issue a notice of violation and start to impose fines, and those can get pretty hefty, up to $10,000 per day. We can issue an order under section 315.18 of part 315, which is what we commonly refer to as a dam safety order, where maybe it's not urgent that we think the dam's going to fail overnight, but it's something that's gone on too long or may endanger the dam, and we order the owner now to take necessary steps to alleviate that danger. Then there's another type of order where it's more related to the presence or the existence or the operation of a dam that's causing repeated impacts, where this is called like an order to limit operations or order to remove a dam. So we can order the dam owner to stop operating the dam in a way that's causing an issue, or we can actually order them to remove the dam if there's no other remedy that exists. And then we have the emergency order provision in 315.21, which is where we can't wait. It's urgent. It has to happen right away. We order the dam owner to take necessary action. If they can't or will not take that action, then that gives the department the authority to step in and do the work, and then we can sue the owner to recoup the costs. So that's all review. Here's some a little more statistics and thoughts that we had. When owner, sometimes taking action is easy. We can go out there and open a gate or start a drawdown or do something like that, that reduces the risk of failure and lessens the impacts if the dam were to fail, and buys us some time. So when the owner is compliant, a lot of times when we've issued orders in past, it was with the full compliance of the owner. The owner maybe wanted to do the right thing but didn't have any money, or was otherwise shackled from doing the right thing, and so we were able to issue an order and get the process started, and that was actually helpful to the owner. And it's a note that we wanted to make, is that around 70% of the dam owners in Michigan are private, and sometimes it's a single person. A single property owns the dam, and if we say you must take this action, a lot of times the message we receive is, I would love to take that action, I just don't have the funding to do so. So that's when we can step in sometimes, or have stepped in the past. And sometimes the remedy is easy. I mentioned this before. We can instruct the dam owner to just start pulling stop logs or opening gates and lowering the water level behind the impoundment, and sometimes that achieves the desired risk reduction, and we feel comfortable that the dam is not going to fail. But not all dams have the ability to significantly lower the water level behind the dam. And sometimes the drawdown doesn't eliminate the risk. If the pond were to refill during a large flood, and the hazard still exists, with failure and the consequence of failure. So that was just to say, so here's some success stories where, and these are all drawdowns, but in Tecumseh Dam in 2011, the owner of the dam was a corporation, a land developer that suffered the collapse of the housing market and was unable to maintain the dam. The operator contacted us and said, I'm not getting paid, so I'm going to stop operating the dam. And the gates needed to be moved during a flood or else the dam would fail. So this was a significant hazard dam. So we issued an emergency order and went down to the dam and opened the gates and started to lower the pond. We got it down about 2 feet before the locals stepped in and said, no, we want to maintain the pond. And they started the Part 307 lake level process. The county took over, ownership of the dam and eventually, made some improvements and maintained the water level. And in the short term, they actually hired an operator so that they didn't have to do the full drawdown in the interim. Corunna in 2012, that was an old dam that was deteriorating rapidly. There was fear that it might fail at any time. That's another significant hazard dam, where we ordered the owner, which was the city of Corunna, to draw down the impoundment. And they did not. They contested the order. They contested our ability to issue the order. And it was a long court battle, and it went all the way up to the Court of Appeals, and they petitioned the Supreme Court, but that got denied. But it took about 4 years to solve that legal dispute. But in the meantime, we had the authority to issue an emergency order, knowing that the city was not going to comply. We actually hired a contractor and began the drawdown, and that cost of that was about $11,000. So it wasn't an exorbitant amount of money. So we were able to do that relatively quickly. So we lowered the water level, fought the court battle, prevailed. Our orders were upheld, and it was proven that the city did own the dams and did need to comply with those orders. And eventually, the city looked at their options. They looked at repairing the dam, saw that funding was limited, and actually obtained a lot of grant funding from the state and from the feds to remove the dam. And that dam was fully removed in 2019. And then Centerville, 2016, this was an interesting one, but it was a low hazard dam. But the dam owner actually called us and said, I have a property access dispute with my neighbor, who apparently access was through an easement through the property, but there was like near fisticuffs between the neighbor and the dam owner. And they basically said, you can't come across my property to access the dam. There was a 5-inch rainfall in the forecast, and we were scared that if the dam wasn't operated, the gates weren't open, the dam was going to fail. So that was one where actually the owner was asking us to step in. What authorities do you have to help me out? Because I want to go to the dam, I want to open the gates, I don't want it to fail, but I'm fearing that I'm going to get a physical altercation if I try to step foot on this guy's property. So long story short, is we issued that order. We brought law enforcement out with us. We started the drawdown, and we drew it down all the way, took all the gates right out of the dam and drew it right down to the base of the dam. And it sits that way today because the owner and the neighbor can't play nice. So so there are some successes, but it's not always that easy. The owners aren't always compliant. They may contest everything we do. They might go to circuit court and try to get a temporary restraining order or an injunction, so that would stop us from being able to, enact our orders. But not only that, it takes a lot of time and effort, to do something like this, to, get the documents, get the permitting, because we still have to issue permits to ourselves if we take the action. We have to fund them, which is not always cheap, and we don't have a really great process right now for access to large amounts of money. So if it's something we can do for a few $1,000s and or just staff time, that's relatively easy. But if you talk about some of these larger dams and the larger remedies where the cost might be in the millions, that takes a lot more effort to orchestrate. And I'm going to have somebody joining me here, it sounds like. Anyway, so that was just kind of a brief overview of sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not. And then, so getting into the SDSO recommendations, and we'll get into these in detail, but the big ones that we took away were that the dam safety program should complete a portfolio-wide risk assessment, which is basically a ranking of the risks and of dam failure and across all dams, to put them in a top-down list and then prioritize compliance and enforcement efforts based on the worst, to the best. Develop a kind of implement a program where we would take action more often and make sure that that enforcement action escalates progressively until we achieve the desired outcome, instead of sitting on these things for a long period of time, if that's the case. Utilize the drawdown orders more frequently, because that can be a good way to inspire dam owners to take action. Is, we're going to lower your lake level until you can figure this out. And that can be done relatively cheaply if the dam has the ability to do that. Develop cross trainings between the dam safety, the compliance enforcement, and the Attorney General staff, so that we kind of know the process and have streamlined that process, so it's not, reinventing the wheel every time we want to take action, at a dam. Set up this dam safety emergency fund. And this is the big one, right? Like, if the state had a pot of money to pull from, and that was replenished and, had a secured long-term funding, it would be much easier for the state to step in, issue emergency orders, and go alleviate dangers at dam when the owner is unwilling or unable. So I think that's kind of the big one. But then there's also the flip side to that coin, which is, if the dam owners truly don't have the resources to maintain the dam, we need to get creative on funding sources for them as well, so that before it gets to an emergency where we would have to exercise our emergency authorities and step in and access this emergency pot of money, we could help the owner secure funding to maintain the dam in a safe condition when costs are lower, when the urgency is lower, and we don't have the threat of the dam failing in the meantime. So, and some of the recommendations that the ASDSO recommended were revolving loans, grants, and I think there's some others in there as well, but we'll probably get into that in more detail. So this was another big point of the ASDSO report, is that we don't have a formal standard dam safety emergency response plan. For, in general, when a dam fails, this is the department's role. This is what the dam safety program staff should be doing. This is how we should be interacting with the local emergency managers and the state emergency management. We have a process that's that we follow, but it's not formalized. It's not written down. So I think that was one of the big takeaways, was that, you can see the bullets. This is what we do. And that's how we plug ourselves into and offer our assistance, and, try and make sure that communication is flowing appropriately, but it's not formalized specifically for dams. I think that the department has emergency response plans and they have typical procedures, but the recommendation from the ASDSO was to formalize that plan specifically for dam safety. And then, so here's the recommendation. So develop a general dam emergency response plan, which does what I just talked about. And here's a couple other good ones too. Currently, we only require that emergency action plans are reviewed and updated as necessary each time the dam is due for inspection. So that'd be every 3 or 4 years for high and significant dams, which are required to have any emergency action plan. They recommend doing that annually, which is probably a good idea, and it's not a lot of effort, to make sure that the phone numbers and the names have not changed, because the last thing you want to do during a dam emergency is pick up a plan, dial a phone number, and get a disconnected, or a guy who says, I don't do that anymore, so that's just wasting time, and that's, potentially putting people at risk. So adopt a standard EAP format. We definitely do recommend that dam owners use a standard format, and that's the NRCS EAP template, but we don't have the authority to require them to use that standard format. So there's a FEMA 64, which is a document for emergency action planning for dams, implements the NRCS EAP template. We would love to make that the gold standard. Use that. Everybody use that. And it would just, promote consistency, and everybody would know where everything is located in the plan. So that would be a suggestion that I would wholeheartedly agree with, is adopting of a standard format.
So a quick time check here. We have about 25 minutes left in the session here, and we have, I think, about 12 or 14 recommendations to walk through, and we will be walking through the recommendations from the report one by one.
Yep. This is the last bullet. So I'll finish this last one. Periodic testing of and exercising of EAPs. Currently, the state does not have a requirement for state regulated dam owners to exercise their emergency action plans. And we've found through our, through like Consumers Energy or other FERC regulated dams, that exercising the EAP identifies deficiencies, it streamlines the process, it gets everybody in the room together so that they know each other and aren't afraid to call each other, things like that. So that's another recommendation I would agree with wholeheartedly, is to exercise the EAPs on some regular time frame. And I think that's it. So you can have the mic.
Yeah, sorry to rush you through there, Luke. We're just trying to get through in the time that we have here today. So if it's helpful here, I'll go ahead and pull up the recommendations that were shared, by Elizabeth. And I got to pick the right screen myself here. Compliance, there we go. Okay, is everyone able to see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so again, the process here that we plan to go through is to hear from members of this group and whether they want to adopt the recommendations as written, identify those that may be not applicable, and then identify those that need additional refinement. And again, we would ask that that refinement be reserved for offline. We would ask members to work on those either independently or together and bring them back for discussion at the fourth meeting. So I think we'd like to walk through these one by one, and I'll read or summarize the recommendation here and then pause for discussion, and then we'll look to those decision points for the group. So
may I ask a couple of clarifying questions first?
Yeah, please.
So Luke, in your original briefing, we talked about 85 high hazard dams. Is that the category of high and significant hazard dams, so the 85 that we spoke of?
No, there's 85 high hazard potential dams. I think about another 150 significant hazard dams.
Okay.
So a total of 330 or so, something like that, or 230. I gotta check my math.
35-ish. Okay. Out of the population of roughly 1,000 that are regulated by the state, correct?
Correct. Yep, that's regulated dams, and then there's the FERC regulated dams too that are high, significant, and low as well. So, but we don't regulate those directly.
Okay. I'll add my comments as we walk through the recommendations. John.
Thank you, John. Okay. So within compliance and enforcement, recommendation from the ASDO 14-A, which is to establish a priority at the senior management level for portfolio-wide compliance and enforcement. See Luke's visitor there in the background. How do members feel about that recommendation? Is there support? Is that one that the group would like to advance?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely imperative that there be that kind of a view, but I don't want to digress us here, but one bias I have is that underlying all of this is that funding problem, right? Because no matter what we require of people, if they don't have the resources or the capability to respond to it, we're going to be in a do loop. And so if we do a portfolio-wide review of some sort, which I would agree we need to, we somehow have to flag where resources are the underlying problem. And so I remember when we reviewed the 85 high hazard dams, it wasn't clear to me that in all cases we knew who even owned them. So we got to know who owns them. And then particularly for those that have a safety significance, we've got to assess whether there is financial or resource capability to uphold their responsibilities. And so when I hear stories of, it's a private owner, one person, I mean, they're not going to be able to do what is needed out of any of these recommendations if we don't address that. Because if you identify, and I draw from my experience in nuclear, and the same with FERC related stuff, is you can find someone all you want, you can mandate all you want, but if they simply cannot do that, we also need to have an understanding of that issue, because there's the structural conditions of the dams and things that are evolving. But if that's an underlying issue, we need to flag that as part of this portfolio-wide review.
Yeah, John, that's really sticking for me as well. That was sort of my first reaction to carving out the recommendations that we've just seen in front of us is this underlying foundation of the resources. And so we can look through these recommendations, figure out if there's white space, and then prioritize, but all of that will require the resources to hit the priority recommendations.
Okay.
Yeah, great points. And there is another group working on the funding recommendations. And so in terms of process here, when the subgroups come back together as a full group, you'll have an opportunity to review that group's thinking and talk about the funding component, because that certainly underpins all of the other recommendations here that we're talking about. So absolutely, a fair and great point.
Just to pile on there, one of the things that I saw too that I think probably is in that white space that we talked about is we have to create space for a conversation where we ask the question about whether the current compliance activities that we have access to are sufficient. Because there's a certain assumption here that throughout, if we have adequate funding, if we tighten up some of the process here, that the tools that we have access to compel compliance or to enforce the rules themselves are sufficient. And I think, one of the things that we learned in the Edenville experience is that, you can have a recalcitrant owner who is sort of undeterred by our use and employment of all the compliance and enforcement tools that we might have and still have a bad outcome. And so that kind of calls into question whether or not we've got access to the right compliance or enforcement tools. And I just want to kind of flag that or signpost that as an issue we should spend a little time thinking about, that all the current tools that we have access to now may not be enough to move or motivate a recalcitrant dam owner to do what they need to do. And that in and of itself is a problem we need to contend with.
Yeah. Appreciate that perspective, Director. And as we look forward to the next meeting of this group, I think that's where we intend to talk more about that white space and the additional recommendations that may fall beyond what was identified through the ASDO report. So we will carve out and make that space in the process here and talk in detail more about that at the fourth meeting. So our next meeting. So coming back to recommendation 14A from the ASDO, we heard John say that he would support that priority. How do others feel? Is that one that this group would like to advance?
This is Luke. I know I'm not a member of the task force per se, but I would say just offer that this portfolio wide risk assessment there is a procedure that's been developed by the ASDSO that we could probably look at and see if that's something that this group thinks that the process is good enough and we should just follow the process, or if it needs to be amended for Michigan specific needs. But just to put that out there, that this development of compliance and priority list and doing the priority led portfolio assessment is something that we can pull from the work of others to implement, I believe, if that process would work for us.
Appreciate that background, Luke. I think Dana and Director Clark, I both saw you unmute your mics at around the same time there.
I would just mention that I think this is an excellent recommendation to follow up on. Without a lot of background at this time, it would be helpful to see specifically what's been proposed, but yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Thumbs up from Director Clark there too. Anyone opposed here to advancing this recommendation? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to keep moving here. Just recognizing the time constraints that we have before us today. We have only about 15 more minutes left with the group. So 14B here, development of a compliance and enforcement priority list with 10 or 20 of the most problematic dams initially identified for focused follow-up. Any objection to advancing that recommendation, or is this one where additional thought and discussion is needed?
Yeah, I hate to keep getting in the details of additional, modifications to the recommendation. For me, I think a priority, I do agree, priority list, absolutely. You got to focus yourself on the priorities. Limiting it to 10 or 20 as an initial start here, I think there needs to be some threshold of when is the risk posed by the dam reach a point that needs additional action. So that may be more than 10 or 20 if our population of the priority dams is 235. And that's the only modification I would make is not restricted to the top 10, because we may have 50 that pose a risk, and we need to know that rather than say, well, here's the 10 worst, because number 23 might jump to the top of the list if we don't have awareness to that. So that's the only modification I would make.
Okay.
I was going to add the same point. I agree completely with John on that one.
Okay, great, thank you. Thoughts from others? See heads nodding.
I think the intent there was to, set a realistic goal, right? Based on funding levels and staffing levels. So, but yeah, I think you're right. If the number's 25 or 30, then the number's 25 or 30. But I think the delineation here is that you probably can't address every compliance and enforcement action in year one. You have to prioritize the top ones and go after those, and then as staff time allow, go after the lower, the ones that are a little tougher to get at. So
Yeah, totally agree.
I'm just going to say what we all know, which is when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. But I do think that, Dana and John are raising a really good point, which is that we shouldn't arbitrarily set a line.
Yeah. So it sounds like folks are in agreement here in modifying that recommendation to use a risk-based screening approach to set the priority list. Okay. Moving on then to recommendation 14C. This is regarding conducting a monthly meeting to follow up on and track the dam specific strategies for the most problematic structures identified through that prioritization list. And maybe that's an area where the highest priority of the highest risk sites could be focused on.
So I just got to, I kind of have a big thought, sorry, just to back us up for a hot second. I'm feeling like what we're looking at here, it's going to be unlikely that anybody on this team is going to say we don't want to advance any of these recommendations. Like maybe we should flip it just for the ability to have additional discussions here. Would that make sense to folks?
That makes sense to me, Liesl. Maybe, John, what we can do is as we work through these, kind of call out whether there's more refinement that we want to do on any of these recommendations or additional discussion, kind of like what John's brought forward and Dana. Is there a further drill down we need to do? And if so, we can kind of task that out prior to our next meeting. Because I think, like Liesl's right, that it's unlikely we're going to say, well, we shouldn't move that one forward, but there may be some that we say, hey, we think this recommendation is ready for prime time as it is. And there may be others that we say, well, we just need to drill down on that a little bit more and make sure we've got it dialed in.
I guess I'm also curious too. To me, I'm kind of seeing two different sides of this. Number one, what are these recommendations that the department already has the internal authority to take action on? Do those really need to go forward from the task force because it's something that they can already pursue internally with their own resources, capabilities, and authority? Versus what are some of these recommendations that are going to need to take executive action and create more awareness from the governor's office, as well as from state legislators and other departments that may be involved with being able to accomplish these activities or actions. So I think that's kind of how I'm weighing it as well.
I agree, Abby. And one of the things that comes to mind for me is, this might be something Luke could address, but places where we want more enforcement, right? We all want more enforcement. So in some scenarios, that is a resource issue, as we've already raised in the last few minutes. But in some scenarios, it might mean that we need additional support from the legislature so that there is stronger statute in order to pursue folks when, you know, they're acting in a way where they're not cognizant of the damages, the potential damages that they're posing to the public and to the environment. So I guess I'm kind of pulling that out too, which is, I think that this group would be interested in making those recommendations where beefing up the statute gives Luke and the team more ability to enforce. Does that make sense? Okay. I think I need a cup of coffee.
Well, I appreciate that feedback here, and we're certainly happy to adapt the strategy and the approach here. So, you know, we can plan to move forward with all the recommendations from the ASDO report, advancing from this group and talking through potential modifications and revisions here.
And like we're all gonna agree that there should be a monthly triage meeting, right? We don't have to talk about that.
Right.
But what do we need to talk about? Like, where is there additional input?
Yeah, that would be my suggestion, is kind of flag them as Dan had said, this one doesn't need any more work, it's ready to go, but these are the ones the task force needs to focus in on, and then have that be the you know, the path forward.
Right. So with about 10 minutes left here, you know, some of these are relatively straightforward, like the compliance triage meeting. Are we able to quickly identify those that the team thinks will take more rigorous and thoughtful discussion, and then we can focus our conversation for the fourth meeting on those?
Well, it sounded like when Luke did his presentation, maybe that there's no current formal plan for dam failure, like create an emergency plan and help them get an outline or something.
Creation of a standardized approach, a template for the emergency action plans.
Yeah, well that, and then he said also there's no current formal plan for dam failure. Like if a dam failure happens, there's nothing formal in place.
Isn't that recommendation number 1 there under EAPs?
That it is, John.
Just looking at these, John, I think, you know, number, let's see, it'd be 14D. That's one that we would need to unpack a little bit more, you know, development of that policy and that pathway for progressive enforcement. That's one that I think probably needs to get unpacked a bit more. We need to drill down on what exactly that looks like, or kind of kick out some work on that. Same thing with 14G. It looks like it's at least on the top of my screen there. You know, same thing. Like, what's that? How do we initiate or create the environment where we can initiate that conversation? That might be one that we want to drill down on a little bit more. 14H is pretty self-explanatory. You know, we want to take money and dump it in this account and use it there. Those are ones that, just as I'm scrolling through, look like we might want to just kind of flag for some more. And then 14H is one we could probably just kind of kick out. Or kick forward, I should say.
Yep. Are there others that members would like to nominate for additional discussion, focused discussion at the fourth meeting of this group?
Well, when I look at it's 15B, which is item 2 under EAPs. So that second bullet that says for changes in population and facilities at risk as a result of hazard creep. So I can just tell you those analyses are not simple. And when you're triggered to reanalyze, I don't know how realistic that is. So I think if nothing else, we need to further discuss what are we asking people to do on an annual basis? And you know, there could be a lot of disagreements of whether the hazard has creeped to a point where you've got to update your EAP. So
I would just piggyback that and say 15A through E all would require policy changes, statute changes, or, you know, or at least a lot more discussion on what these plans look like, right? So I think all of the emergency action plan ones warrant further discussion by the group. Because we don't have those requirements in state statute or in current policy right now.
Can I loop back to enforcement too?
Please do.
There's a lot here about more enforcement, but Luke, what kind of tools do we need in order to do more enforcement? Like it's one, I mean, obviously money, but like, I guess I'm curious about an articulation of, you know, what additional tools, authority, levers are necessary to do that additional enforcement.
So I think that with more staff and funding, you know, an emergency fund, we could utilize a lot of the tools that we have at our disposal, just do it more frequently and stick with it, right? But I think that what I forget who it was, it might have been John or Dan pointed out, is that we're kind of in a responsive mode where it's like critical. I mean, in order for us to go out there and do work currently in the statute, it has to be at the point where we have determined that failure is imminent. If we don't go out and take action, it's going to fail. So it'd be nice if we could dovetail that, you know, using our current authorities or expanding our current authorities, coupled with getting creative about funding with for the dam owners to be more proactive and get to it before it's an emergency. But like I said, I think when it comes to emergency orders and things like that, and being able to, we have the tools at our disposal. We just have limited resources to be able to implement those tools on a very broad scale or for very large projects.
I think I heard you say two things though, Luke. I think I heard you say we could use more authority in statute because all we can do is when people are obviously negligent, right? You
Yeah.
want to get to a point where it's not, you don't have an imminent failure when you have an ability to get an outcome without an imminent failure, I think is what I'm trying to say.
We have limited, so we have the authority to order the owner to do that, right? But we don't have the authority to step in and take any action until we determine that it's an emergency. But that's what comes to the point is, you know, we can order the owner to do it, but if, you know, they can't comply or won't comply, then we still have the hazard hanging out there until it becomes an emergency. So it'd be nice to have the carrot and the stick, right? You know, but I don't know how that all plays together, but certainly warrants further discussion, you know, on how it all ties together, because we want to be more proactive. But I think also on the other hand, you don't want the state stepping in and taking action for dam owners preemptively because they don't want to, you know. I don't think that's a good model to follow unless, you know, that's, you know, to socialize that cost and do that. But I don't know if that's the answer.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've heard here the desired approach from the members. We are running up on the end of our 45 minutes here together. Had a tall order to get through, you know, all of these recommendations and talk through them in that short period. So appreciate everybody identifying the topics that the group would like to discuss at the next meeting. And so with that here, I'd actually suggest here that we transition off into our next breakout sessions, which are scheduled to begin just at 11:15.
All right, thanks, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.